Welcome to the Air Mobility Command Museum down here attached to the Dover Air Force Base. I'm lucky enough to be sitting in a C-17 Globemaster III simulated cockpit, and my uncle Larry Robertson used to help build these things in Southern California. So let's go see if we could talk to Mike Leister. He's the curator and the director of the museum. And see about all the great things they have going on here down at Dover Air Force Base Air Mobility Command Museum. Mike, this is a very special plane, isn't it? Tell us a little bit about this airplane.
Well, this is actually a combat glider, something you wouldn't think about. There are very few of them left in the world, about 10. They built 13,000 for World War II. It was a strong airplane, but it was a fragile airplane. It was meant to haul 15 troops into combat with no engine. So they were towed behind a C-47 and released, and a number of them could land in small fields and put enough infantry troops together to make a worthwhile fighting force.
Wow, that's amazing. What did they tow it with? How did they get it up to altitude again?
Well, mostly with C-47s. They did use some other kind of tow airplanes, but a C-47, which was a twin cargo plane itself, could actually tow two of these at once. And the pilots that flew these were mostly enlisted pilots, and they were expected to become infantrymen when the airplane landed until they could be retrieved and brought back for another mission. So being an infantryman and a pilot were two very dissimilar skills.
Yeah, that's really interesting. 13,000 of them made, only 10 left in the world?
About 10 left in the world, and it's made from wood and fabric and string, literally, and tape, and it's an incredible piece of engineering. And because World War II, all the big aircraft manufacturers were busy making bombers and fighters, these were built by furniture manufacturers, casket makers, and piano makers. And there's actually mahogany plywood in some of them that was used because they had it when the war started, so they used it to build airplanes.
Yeah, I noticed that. That was really interesting. Let's head on to the next one. What's this next beautiful piece in your display?
Well, this is one of everybody's favorite airplanes. It's a B-17G. It's probably one of, if not the most, well-recognized airplanes from World War II. It was America's premier heavy bomber until the B-29 came along later in the war. But it was the airplane that crews loved. It would bring you back with huge holes in the wings with two engines shot out. It was an airplane that you could identify with. Back during the war, they allowed people to paint nose art, pin-up art on the airplanes. It was to remind you of home. There were contests to see who could get the most ridiculous name for their airplane. Sleepy Time Gal is a rather tame one, actually, and it's named after a famous song of the era. And some people look at the nose and they say, well, why are there swastikas on an American airplane? And then people that are really perceptive say, why are the swastikas painted backwards? Well, the first is this airplane was given credit for shooting down 3 German aircraft, and that's how they identified that. And the swastikas were painted backwards for 2 different, very dissimilar reasons. The first, with some airplanes, 19-year-old American GIs didn't know forward from backwards with a swastika. They just knew it was a bent cross. And then the ones that did recognize it sometimes painted them backwards to dishonor the insignia. So it's a little bit of history there that you don't read in textbooks.
Yeah, that's interesting. What about that helicopter I saw underneath that wing? What is that one all about over there?
It's a rather unusual helicopter. We have some pretty unusual airplanes in this museum. It is the only production helicopter, military helicopter in the world that has wooden rotor blades. So the blades of this are built similar to a wing. They have hollow spaces in the back, a spar in the front, and ribs that go down the middle. The rotor blades also turn in opposite directions, so you don't need a tail rotor like you do on most modern helicopters. The reason that was good, it translated all of the power from the engine into lift, rather than having to waste some on a tail rotor.
Gotcha. What was the purpose of that?
This was a rescue helicopter most of the time, and it's interesting, when the Air Force retired these, a number of them were built or bought by logging companies to go fly out into the thick wooded areas and lift individual, what they call specimen trees out, that they would fly them to veneer mills and cut expensive veneer, because this airplane or this helicopter could make a tremendous amount of lift and could hover in place, so they could actually pick up a tree and haul it out of a woods.
Wow, that's really interesting. And another special piece inside of this great museum. And again, a reminder for those that want to visit, you don't need access to the Air Force Base. There's a whole separate entrance where you can come on in and enjoy this wonderful facility. What's this next one here we've got here? The turf sport? What is that?
Turf and Sport Special was our very first airplane. It's how we began this museum. When we got it, nobody else wanted it because it had been used as a target by the Army and a lift load for their helicopters. So it had been crushed and beat up in all different kind of ways. After we got the airplane, we did the research and found out that it was a very significant airplane. We have the records. We were able to locate the crew chief who flew with this airplane during the war, and he saved every piece of paper the Army Air Force ever gave him. The records we have came from him, not from the Air Force records, because there were too many that were lost in the war. Anyhow, this airplane dropped paratroops on Saint-Mariglis on D-Day. This year is the 70th anniversary. This week they're actually celebrating the successes of World War II, but also commemorating the losses. And this airplane was almost lost, but our volunteers were able to restore it in about 18 months. And that was a Herculean effort because the windows were shot out, the flight controls were gone, the cowling were missing. It was a really large job, and when we started this, we were fairly inexperienced at the job of finding old airplane parts. But we continue to find parts. We just, within the past month, have installed a special carrier outside of the fuselage that was used so they could drop supplies to paratroopers at the same time they were dropping paratroopers.
Interesting. And then off right above the camera guy is the wonderful, we've got, it looks like we've got another glider up there, right? It's Angel Eyes?
Yeah, and actually I think we're the only museum in the country that has both the CG-4A, the combat glider, and the TG-4A, which was the trainer. And this was one of those examples where good intentions didn't work out. They bought these commercial gliders right off the shelf in order to teach glider pilots how to fly. And they found out, unfortunately, these were actually sailplanes. They were meant to glide for long distances. They were very lightweight. And the CG-4, the combat glider, was built like a truck, and it had carried a heavy load. So they found out that trying to glide with the special glider trainers was actually not as good a training as taking standard light airplanes and shut the engine down and let the glider pilot learn to fly an airplane without any propulsion.
Gotcha. Then over to the biplane. Let's head on over to this area here. This is a really special one. Gosh, I really love biplanes. They're so amazing in what they're able to do. You know, it's pretty incredible, isn't it?
And they're evocative of a bygone era. Biplanes, you usually think about the early Wright brothers and you think of World War I, but we were still using biplanes as trainers all the way through World War II. This is a PT-17, which stands for Primary Trainer. And this is the airplane that most pilots in the United States Army Air Force or the United States Navy learned to fly in. Your first 60 hours of training was in a biplane like this. Then you moved up to a monoplane with a fixed landing gear. Then you moved up to a much more powerful monoplane with a retractable landing gear. And then you were sent to a unit to get finished on whatever kind of airplane you were going to fly.
Well, inside is really interesting. We've got the simulators, and that was a really exciting part of my morning, was flying those simulators. Can't wait to kind of get outside and see what's going on outside. Inside is beautiful, but outside is got to be the place where everyone needs to come, and we've got some special ones out here. Mike, tell us about them.
We do, because we're the only museum in the entire country that specializes in airlift and air refueling airplanes, and these are big airplanes. You can go see a fighter airplane in a little park, but these airplanes you can haul a fighter in. So the most important airplane out here, by some estimations, that shouldn't be sitting out is this C-54. It is actually a veteran of the Berlin airlift, and it's the last C-54 left in the world that was specially modified to haul coal during the Berlin airlift. If you haven't checked your history books lately, from 1948 to 1949, all of the food, medicine, and coal that was needed to run the electrical plants for the whole city of Berlin was flown in by American and British airplanes. So a city of 1.2 million people got virtually everything they had by air. The Soviets thought they could starve us out. It didn't work. It was a great propaganda victory, but even more important, the German people were bitter after the end of World War II, obviously, and it wasn't going all that wonderfully to put Europe back together. And when everybody who had been an enemy of Germany came together to save the city, it did more than all the politicians lined up could ever have done to heal the wounds of World War II. And we keep this airplane here as a monument to those folks. And we actually have a veteran that lives in Dover that flew this airplane in the Berlin airlift.
That's pretty amazing.
It is indeed.
So that is the as far as value, that's the most valuable aircraft out here. What's your second most valuable aircraft?
Well, it's all an argument, and everybody asks me what my favorite airplane is, and I always tell them the next one. I guess one of the most special airplanes we have is we are the only museum in the world to have a C-5 now.
Yeah, that's amazing.
It is an amazing thing. We have a C-5A model, which were the original type of C-5. They have the early TF-39 General Electric engines. The new C-5s, the engines are 75% more powerful, and they're much more reliable, and they're quieter. They use a lot less fuel, and they have brought the C-5 up another dimension in capability. We love to watch the new ones take off because you can hardly hear them, and they climb like a homesick angel. They really do have a lot more power. And we've preserved the legacy C-5A model, and this one is actually special because it is the only aircraft ever in the world to have launched an ICBM from in flight. So we actually have a Minuteman missile parked beside the airplane, so you can get an idea what it would be like to open the back doors, pull it out with a parachute, and then launch a missile.
That's amazing. And then right next to it is what, a refueler?
Well, there are two refuelers side by side. The first one is a KC-97. That was a very early tanker. It was a propeller-driven airplane originally, but by the time they made it into a tanker, it couldn't quite fly fast enough to refuel the early generation of bombers and jet fighters, so they put two jet engines on it. So what started out as a propeller-driven extension of an old World War II bomber ended up to be a six-engine airplane that could be used to refuel the fighters that we had of the era. And then next to that is a KC-135, which is the type of air refueling airplane we still use in the Air Force today. And this one that we have actually served for 50 years before it was retired.
Which one is this one right here?
This is a C-7 Caribou. It's one of the very few airplanes that we've bought for the U.S. Air Force that was built by a foreign country, if you want to call Canada a foreign country. It was built by de Havilland. Its purpose was to replace the old C-47 because it's a twin-engine airplane. It's made to take off and land from unimproved runways. It's made to be rugged and dependable, and it was all those things, but it never did replace the C-47. There are still C-47s flying all over the world, and all the C-7s are now retired. This was used a lot in Vietnam to resupply the Special Forces camps. It was used for airdrop, and when we got it, it had been used as the airdrop airplane for the Golden Knights, which is the Army's premier parachute team. So when we got it, it was painted gold and white and black stripes.
Got it. What's the, there's one over there with a tail identifier, Pope. Is that Pope Air Force Base? How did it get here?
It is Pope Air Force Base, and one of the jokes we make is it's not the Pope's airplane. It came from Pope Air Force Base. It was due to be retired because C-130s have been in production for over 50 years and are still being produced. This was an earlier model. It was time to stand it down. So they flew it up here from Pope Air Force Base, parked it, put it in our museum, and we keep it in those markings because one of the things we do here is wherever possible, we recreate or preserve the original markings that these airplanes flew with. We don't try to make each one look like something Chuck Yeager flew. We try to keep them historically accurate.
And then making our way around, it looks like we have an Air Force too.
We do. We have a VC-9, which was used by every vice president from Nelson Rockefeller, and yes, he was vice president, up to Dick Cheney. It was also used as Air Force One when the president needed to go into smaller airports. President Reagan, Clinton, Bush Sr., and Bush Jr. all used it as Air Force One. In the case of President Clinton, we have that year's records, and he used it 12 times in 1 year. So actually, it spent a lot of time as Air Force One. But the last 5 years of its career, it mostly served as the First Lady's airplane and to take congressional DVs around the world.
Gotcha. So can you do me a favor? Can we go up in the tower? Is that a possibility?
We can walk over to the tower right now.
Mike, this is special. This is very special. A control tower on an active Air Force base. This is really, really great. How many of these are in America?
As far as I know, there's only 4 in America that you can climb up in, and this is the only one on a military base that I'm aware of. Now, this is a retired tower. It was active from 1956 until 2009. When they were going to tear it down, we asked to save it and bring it over to the museum, so we trucked it 1.25 miles. We put it up on a shorter tower because we're so close to the runway, we can't be as tall as it originally was. And we almost every time when visitors get to the top of the stairs, we get a wow because it's a tremendous view. There's a lot to see from up here. You can listen to active tower transmissions and you can see what's going on. It is something the general public very seldom ever gets to see.
Yeah, this is really special. Okay, before we leave you, just go over your hours. What are your hours of the week that you can take visitors?
We're open every day but Monday from 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. We're always free parking, and you don't have to go on to Dover Air Force Base to get to us. You take exit 91 off Delaware Route 1 and just follow the signs 1/2 mile. It'll bring you right into the museum. And kids of all ages, families, love this place because we give you the opportunity to learn as much as you want. You can walk around and just look at the big airplanes, or you can read the signs, or what is one of our special features, we have a lot of very dedicated tour guides that will tell you not only about the history of the airplanes, but it'll tell you about their military history in a lot of cases as well.
How many volunteers you have here?
I'm very proud of the fact we have over 170 active volunteers. Some restore airplanes, some work in our museum store, and some give tours, and they're all family.
Well, this is a jewel, and families need to get down here to Kent County to check this out. What a beautiful place, what a beautiful facility. Mike, thank you so much for your hospitality. Have a great day, buddy.
Thank you.